All right, Cobus, how on earth are you, my friend?
I still got my VOX cap. I should have brought it from the room, so I think it's
Yeah.
the only one in Africa.
Probably is actually, yeah.
So I'm representing the continent. Just trying to keep up with what's happening. Like things are unfolding like at a crazy pace in the
Yeah,
space. So just trying to keep up with what's happening.
keep on top. You do a good job of keeping on top of it, to be fair. Always, always writing, you're always publishing, you're always kind of got stuff out of everyone who I know in this space, you're probably the one who I think is more on top than any other.
So crazy story. So Substack introduced a AI detect AI writing detector, right?
Right.
So I quickly, did a blog. AI helped me, and in Substack's detector said 100% human written. And then I spent so much time handcrafting a blog. I put it on Substack, and they said, "This is AI written. It's not human written." They got it the wrong way around.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think 'cause sometimes I have caught myself having to like unlearn some of the bad traits that AI brings in. You know, the kind of
Yeah.
contrast, like it's not this, it's that. And sometimes I'll find myself genuinely wanting to write that. And I think, oh no, I'm not going to bother with that. I can't do that. You know
That's
what I mean?
that's the thing. And Brett Taylor actually recently, the CEO and co-founder of Sierra, he
Mm.
put it on LinkedIn and he said like he's finding himself exactly in that same position where he's writing and putting a hyphen and think, oh, that's a clear signal of AI. I'm taking it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And typically like what does this mean? And the what question for subheadings, in a blog. So you're kind of like writing in the back of your mind, trying to not look like AI. So
Yeah,
it's
you're trying to D.
reverse psychology.
Yes, right. You're trying to DAI yourself. It's mad. Uh, but no, it's a pleasure to speak to you as always. So we go way back really. It's been kind of a long time in this space, covering and talking about and working in the conversational AI space. You've been with a Core for a while now. What have been some of the sort of like I don't know. Well, firstly, actually, Core just again leader in the Gartner's MQ. Congratulations. Every single edition has had Core in the top right hand corner on it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think it's still important to have a platform. There's one guy at Core, we call him the analyst whisperer. I think he's got a gift, but I think it's still important to have a platform. Um, what I find interesting is that recently Sequoia put out an article, which I've read and read it quite a few times, which they call software is the new services is the new software, which I
Mm,
really found interesting. So it's almost like this transition now where a platform is important. A agentic platform like Core recently released the platform they call Artemis, but there's also this component of services is a new software. And someone recently also said FDE is the new PLG. Forward deployed engineers is the new
yeah,
product-led growth.
yeah,
So it's interesting. You still need a platform, I guess, because that allows you to replicate and grow fast. But then you also need this forward deployed engineer play, so to say, where you help with the integration and the onboarding. And it's interesting, there's a lot of new AI native companies where there's no insight, there's nothing to show, right? So they don't actually have a platform per se, where it's more, I guess, more services, more bespoke. But I guess with AI, you've got that speed of deployment and development, which you didn't have previously.
mm. Yeah. I think it's interesting. If you look at OpenAI and Anthropic, they've both acquired pro services firms recently. I think that the kind of promise of the core kind of platform and all platforms similar to it was that, you deploy it and then the business can be self-sustaining. And I think that's probably happened in many cases for Core and for Cognigy and others. You've got clients who've built their own teams, they've built their own capabilities, they're able to fully maximize that kind of product offering. But it actually, for me, I thought that every company would be like that, but that's not actually the case, is it? So actually, you can see now the forward deployed engineers, they were always there. Core always had them.
Mm.
All your competitors and kind of like, colleagues and stuff always had them. But it's only now become evident now that AI is bigger and there's more companies and now everyone's having forward deployed engineers because most businesses don't really have enough capability to be able to properly do it themselves as fast as they need to do it, do they?
Yeah, and on that kind, I find it so interesting because I just looked recently at the contact center because I'm old enough to remember when you phoned John in accounts or Sally in cancellations, you actually spoke to someone in a company, and
Mm,
the call centers came in, and it went through. I think I counted like 4 cycles. The contact center went through, and when I was blown away, one of the companies I really admire is Langchain. So they were one of the first companies to build agent prototypes, AI agents, a piece of software that my definition is a piece of software that can take a complex input and decompose it into sub-steps and then sequentially solve, by, chaining those together. And I saw LangChain has got this agent framework, and I wrote about it. And then it basically, it was like 2 years, 3 years ago, and AI agents were all the rage. Like it was just Salesforce, ServiceNow, everyone spoke about it. And I thought, well, LangChain has been doing that for a while. And to your point about these, re-emergence of terms in a new way, LangChain launched LangGraph, which is
mm,
like, just the nodes and decision points, and graphs were the mainstay of chatbots, right? So the only non-deterministic portion of chatbots were the NLU engine or the NLP engine. The rest was just like a state machine, a graph machine. And now people say, like the last few weeks, graph engineering, like this is the new thing. And the nodes, each node, and I was like, I looked at this and I thought, well, like we've been doing this, right? So graph is like this old, it's been around for yonks. And so all the chatbot providers, like I think there's like 10 or 12 big ones, um, and so it's been around. Graph building tools has been around for yonks. And then I just recently saw LangChain released the articles basically saying, guys, like we launched LangGraph 3 years ago. What's up with this, graph engineering? But I just find it so interesting how these cycles,
yeah,
and then something just emerges all of a sudden. And I wonder if it's not the case where the community is expanding like rapidly.
yeah.
So more people are getting involved in conversational user interfaces just by the nature of language models and AI agents. And I get the sense of the broader audience is discovering this,
Yeah.
and now they're talking about it. Because if you think about, maybe just the last thing, if you think about the chatbot conferences, with Pete Erickson, it was almost like a cult, right?
Yeah, it
it was
was
it
big
was
Scientology or something on it.
yes, it was the same people all the time, right? So
Yeah.
you had I mean, so it was like this shared, very small fraternity, shared, mindset around chatbots, and all of a sudden it broke open, and so the audience is much wider now, and it's almost like as if it's like there's concentric waves, and as people discover these principles, it's new to them, and then you've got the sense like, but we've been graph engineering is what we've been doing for quite a while,
Mm.
so yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I think you're right.
interesting.
I think that's what's happened, and you can tell that by just looking at the development of the platforms as well. In terms of like, I remember I use this analogy all the time, but I remember the first time Salesforce released Agentforce, version 2 of Agentforce was the ability to capture a variable from an utterance. So it's like you can version 2. was that you can extract data from what someone said. So it's like obviously they've learned that lesson by deploying that tool and realizing, holy shit, we need a structured way of gathering information and gathering
Yeah,
data so we can use it elsewhere. And so you're right. I think that it's the old lessons being learned again by kind of people that weren't involved in that first wave of chatbot design. In the same way as when we were involved in that first wave of chatbot design, we were essentially building on top of the work that had gone into like early voice user interface
mm,
systems like the nuance systems and all that kind of stuff that was there in the 90s and early noughties and stuff like that. It's all been there, but I think what we did pretty successfully, I would say, is that you know if you look at the books from like Kathy Pearl and James Jangola and all those kind of people at the time that were writing about this stuff, I think we kind of took that and built on it. Whereas it seems as
yeah,
though there's a little bit of obliviousness in the wider kind of community because it's like everyone's just discovering the fact that you need to have state management in order to
yes,
reliably have a system that does something consistently every time. You can't not have that. You can't just leave it up to a random
yeah.
probabilistic model and a prompt to store everything. It's like it's obvious to us, but it's like, yeah, you're right that the lessons are being learned over and over again.
While were speaking now, okay, like two things came to mind. The one thing is like I think that the chatbot fraternity, or the chatbot OGs, they were too quick, or we were too quick to abandon the basic principles. Because I remember quite a few chatbot companies said intents are dead.
Yeah.
Because like the whole premise, exactly as you said, was around intents and entities, where intents are the verbs and entities are the nouns, basically from utterances. And I've thought to myself, well, intents will never go away because with any conversation, you want to discover someone's intent.
Hmm.
If I walk in at the reception at a bank and I ask for a Big Mac, you know, wrong intent. You've got to go somewhere else, out of domain kind of thing. So I think like we were too quick to like discard basic things because intents. I mean, like so often now people are doing intent clustering and just to see what's the meaning, why people are phoning in, etc., etc. And the other thing that came to mind while you were speaking about this, like this, you know, the full circle is that, when I remember when AI agents were introduced, and it kind of like spelled the end of graphs or graph engineering or call flows because it just did it on the fly. And then that kind of like went on for a while, and then people realized, and sorry, I'm always using LangChain as an example, but I mean, that's a lot of open source software. And all of a sudden people realized like, you can't just have this autonomy. You need to have some kind of what I call bounded autonomy.
Hmm.
So you need some kind of graph approach or flow approach, which is defined. And then like, LangChain introduced LangGraph, which is this, more of a graph approach. So it's interesting that it went that direction. It was too autonomous, too loose, and it came back. And maybe just to mention two things on that. Like I was listening to Andre Karpathy, I think a year back. He spoke at a Y Combinator event, and it's on YouTube. If you just search Y Combinator and Andre Karpathy, and he really emphasized this autonomy slider or an autonomy dial or agency dial. And then he spoke about like even with Tesla and his work with Tesla with full self-driving autonomous vehicles, how in different situations you want to dial autonomy or agency higher or lower. And I think that's what a graph approach gives you. And so I just thought when I was watching it, I was thinking back about this agent like wave that hit us like 2 3 years ago, and everything was full autonomy, and in a sense how immature it was because you still want that kind of like bounded autonomy. And I see graph as almost like AI on rails kind of thing, where you've got like autonomy within a preset framework or graph approach, where the conversation can go, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, especially, in the area that Core works and stuff like that is like you're in the realms of large enterprises that do specific stuff, right? So firstly, what part of that specific stuff that you do is the customer interested in? Which is goes back to your
mm,
intent question. It was interesting to see all of that commentary around conversation design is dead and flows are dead and intents are dead and all that kind of stuff. It was like, well, how else are you going to then understand what someone wants? The whole reason why people were saying that intents are dead is because everyone went absolute all in on RAG, thinking that RAG
yes,
was going to
yes.
solve everyone's problems. Do you know what I'm saying?
That is so true.
Yeah. So intent comes back because you have to have it. You have to be able to understand what someone wants. And therefore, the whole idea around orchestration is really putting someone into the area where you can serve them based on what it is that they need.
Mm,
And then once you're there, you can either, depending on what it is, have that more kind of agentic approach. But actually, if you're a large business that has millions of phone calls every single year, and a customer calls to change their address, is it worth the probabilistic error handling that could come with getting it wrong 1 in 10 times or 1 in 20 times when you could have something that's more deterministic that says, we don't move from this part of the conversation until we've validated who the user is. And once you're in that
mm,
space of the conversation, you might have access to RAG because you might have a question that's related or whatever. But once you're there, you can't get anywhere else until you've done it. And so that's where your
mm,
flow kind of comes in, or your graph, or whatever you want to call it. You're breaking every component down into its isolated components, and you're then orchestrating amongst them to reliably get someone from what,
mm.
what you've identified they need to actually resolving the problem. So it's almost like we have the pendulum swung one way to intents are dead, conversations designs dead, flows are dead, and now it's coming back, which is actually intent's pretty important. Design is important because how do you organize the flow? How do you organize the journey? All that kind of stuff. And then that's where your graphs comes in. So it's like we've gone full circle.
Mm. Yeah, and it's I love what you said about we thought RAG is the ultimate answer because I can distinctly remember my first interaction with a large language model. I think it was OpenAI, and I just said like uh, send an email to the following address. This is the contents, and it came back and it said the email has been sent and delivered. I was like, what? It's like, is it how did this model just do it? Like, has the mail been sent? Like. And then I realized, oh no, there's something like hallucination. Like it just made it up, right? And so it's interesting when you mentioned like we thought drag is the solution because like I think everyone was discovering like how things are unfolding. And I also think like I mean I saw it in Core as well, how with the advent of generative AI, how do you incorporate this new technology and I find it interesting, like the moment, I mean, everyone thinks the new thing will change everything. I saw someone retweeted a tweet when OpenAI launched their flow builder. A
Yeah.
few months back they launched, which is basically a graph engineering. And someone said OpenAI just killed 10,000 startups, something like that. And then someone retweeted that these days and said, "Well, that didn't happen, right? Where's that flow builder? No one is using it."
Yeah.
So it's interesting that we think the next technology is going to change it. And exactly to your point, what you're saying, Kane, is like it's still people that's got a problem that's reaching out to a company, and it's a human experience. And I'll never forget. I was working. When I was still working with a telco, I was working with a customer experience, a user experience guy. Is very good in terms of the user interface. And there's something he said stayed with me. He said, user experience is also how the way the user feels after using the interface. Like
Mm.
you feel good, like that was really, or you feel not that great. And like just to your point, I think it was this psychosis almost of a technology psychosis, and not the idea that it's still people, it's still experience, it's still a customer journey. There's still conversation design involved, and it seems like it's being rediscovered now, to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, which is good, and obviously good for Core because Core can build on what it's been doing for the last decade, and incorporate this kind of stuff, into the platform, which obviously it has done. Um, Going back to what you alluded to earlier, you said that the contact center's been through 4 phases. What are those phases that you've identified?
No, I was just, I was just these days. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kane, but I was thinking about. I mean, I can remember when the whole idea of contact centers was introduced, and I remember how unhappy people were because I can't speak to the same people in the same department. I've got to go to this centralized contact place. And I was just thinking in terms of if you see, even in my estimation, the 4 steps, like, you had like more hardware approach with ACDs and PBXs and, just routing calls. And then somehow that was the first wave of technology, like more hardware. I mean, like companies like, if I just think back, companies like Nortel and, Alcatel and these companies, Rockwell, I think was one, like really embedded. And then there was like a second phase, I would say, of, maybe Genesis and Avaya, more like software-based omni-channel, including the agent in that suite. And then there was like a third wave, and that's where our paths cross, I guess, with conversational user interfaces, chatbots, and deploying the same conversational user interface over voice and chat. And it's something that Micah Groenewegen said, that really stayed with me. She said, in chatbots, we had a problem of scarcity. And then with large language models, we had a problem of abundance. And then and what I find interesting up until, chatbots, like every time the incumbent was, displaced, it feels like that. So to a large degree, they couldn't capture this new market that emerged. Startups captured it and ran with it. If you think of, I mean, if I look at the chatbot companies, most of them are 10 to 12 years old. So they were like founded around about the same time. And now we're in this fourth wave of, where the speech interfaces are really good. I mean, the voice bots are just exceptional. And you've got this new breed of AI native companies that's focusing on delivering AI, via FDEs, and almost like rediscovering that whole process. And I think the challenge now for the chatbot incumbents is like, will we be displaced by the AI native companies that was founded in the last year or two, or will we stem that tide? So it was just interesting for me how it went through those stages. I think you're on mute.
Oh yeah, I muted myself because the dog came in and started barking like.
Winston.
Yeah, Winston. Yeah, he's been while we've been on holiday, so he's just been barking his head off. So it's interesting what you were saying there in terms of like the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave. I wonder whether we're not still in the third wave because what you've seen from the likes of Genesis, Avaya, Mitel, 8x8, 5 9, all those kind of companies is that they've tried to adopt AI. They've all acquired AI companies, like, the chatbot companies sort of thing. But I wouldn't have said necessarily that any one of them have absolutely fully maximized the potential of the acquisition, nor have they really kind of got it to a place where their clients are kind of AI first companies. Do you know what I'm saying? So like the AI is the first touch point for everything, and your human are there to deal with the complex, longer tail stuff. So I
Yeah.
wonder whether we're still in that third phase, essentially, of contact center. I would call it displacement, whereby we are very much moving towards a place where AI will be the first customer touch point. Generative
Mm,
AI is accelerating that because, it's able to understand a lot more. Going back to what I think, if I understand Micah's kind of comment correctly, is that now we're in an age of abundance, as in the models understand absolutely everything, and therefore the scope of what you can potentially do is severely broadened. Which
mm,
means that now you can have something that realistically can answer every single phone call, have a conversation with a customer to understand what it is that you actually need. And if you've already got the automation in place to solve it, then do it. And if you don't, you can build
Yeah.
it. And if you don't build it quick enough or whatever, then you can use your people. So for me, it's like the cores and even the newer companies, as you mentioned, like the Decagons, etc. I think for me, I would put that still as part three because I think where it ends up, or phase three, because where it ends up, I think at least, is the Genesises, the Avayas, the Mitels, and those type of
Mm,
companies end up in the short term or medium term severely shrinking in terms of their market size because everything's going to go through the AI. And I think that they kind of understand it, but for me, their business model isn't adapted to
mm,
either consumption based or outcome based or forward deployed engineering or whatever it needs to be in order to say,
mm,
right, we are an AI company, we deploy AI services, and we just so happen to have the plumbing behind the scenes that when it all goes wrong or when you choose to, you can bring the people in.
mm.
And I think that's what the big disruption is going to be over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you now you know, and while you were speaking, kind that really makes sense. That this idea that we're still in phase three and haven't really moved out. Maybe something that changed, just that created all this focus. I was really amazed. Like I was listening to Elon Musk interview with Dwakesh Patel recently, and he was asked about the biggest use case because SpaceX also launched now a voice bot and Grok
Yeah.
4.5, and then he said the biggest use case is customer experience. You know, like he said, SpaceX is going to double down on customer experience, and I thought to myself, like, that's what we do, right? So, um, and then also, I mean, I listen a lot to Sequoia's content and also Andreessen Horowitz A16Z or Z as we say in South Africa, and like full on double down on customer experience, customer service, investing in that. So maybe that is what I've been seeing in terms of like the interest and the money being pumped in. But to your point, like on the ground, it hasn't maybe to such a degree the revolution on the ground hasn't happened to
Mm.
such a degree. Maybe like if I can say this kind of like off on a tangent, right? But I was like I found this research paper from 1980, and it was all about computers being introduced in enterprises. Where's the return on investment? And I will actually share it with you after the. I'll share it with you. It's so interesting because it was questioning like there was no ROI on computers. The money was being spent. People said it's showing up everywhere except in productivity. They didn't see the productivity, and it was such a parallel with AI. And then the researcher from this paper I found, he went back to electricity, and he likened, the computer to electricity being this revolutionary technology. And then he said how the organizations or the enterprises weren't able to restructure themselves around this new technology. In terms of electricity, how the mills ran, and also with computers. Like it was an analog world. So now you're introducing, computers. And when I read that, it really made me think of where we currently with AI. I mean, it was so interesting. And it reminded me also of what Jensen Hong said around, I mean, people asked him in this one interview, what about jobs in AI? The normal like question. And then he said, well, what is a job? A job is a collection of tasks. So he said, over the last few decades, we took tasks, we bundled them, and we said, right, this is the job description, or this is the name of this job. And then he said, well, we've got to like unbundle the tasks from jobs, look at what needs to be done, and take it from there. So saying all of this to just to illustrate that I think there's a big change needed in enterprises as well. Like the same with electricity and the same with the computer or computers, there needs to be a reorganization to fully leverage and fully use it. And I hear so many people say, with all this technology, customer experience is still bad. And it is, right?
Yes, yeah, it is.
So, so I guess there needs to be a transformation within enterprises as well as a whole.
Yeah.
But maybe a last thing to say, what I really found interesting as well was that um, and that's a subsequent study I read, was that many of the AI native companies or recently found companies, they see customer experience as this beachhead to transform the enterprises.
Mm.
And that really made sense for me, even in the comment of Elon Musk, because a guy that's landing a 16-story, rocket in an ocean, what is his concern with customer experience or customer care? But the whole idea of that being the beachhead and the way AI will be propagated in the organizations and transform them, that made sense as to why many of these venture capital companies are really plowing into customer experience and customer care. If
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. We have a client in government, and I've worked in government for a long time, and it's always been the case that the back end is always in a right mess, and they try government, kind of central government, local government, all try as hard as they can to mask how bad things are behind the scenes by by trying to make the front end pleasurable, But ultimately, you can only make the front end so good unless you sort the back end out. You can only slap so much lipstick on a pig before it's the
Mm,
process itself that is the limiting factor. And I mentioned this client. We just did a piece of work where we did a big load of analysis among a bunch of different service areas, load of different intents, and tried to identify, like, if you were trying to essentially do that, decouple the job to the task, where are the tasks where you could save the most either time, effort,
mm,
or cost? And 90% of the things that we found were nothing to do with conversational AI. They were everything
mm,
to do with, well, why do you have this? When someone submits a document, it sits in a queue and there's no prioritization in the queue. Therefore, if someone gets to it, whenever they eventually get to it and they see something's wrong, they have to go back to the user who has to resubmit the thing that goes to the back of the queue, even though they were just served, it still goes to the back of the queue because there's no prioritization. So it's like one person submitting one document to get one approval could be waiting 2 months. And it's like, well,
yeah,
I can just have a look at the document, see if the information that you need is in there. And if it's not, give it back to the user straight away, take the submission again, manage the queue priority so the user keeps the place, manage the workflow and assign the work to the right people and all that kind of stuff. It's like it can do so much of that stuff. And the knock on effect of that is that when you make an application, you get a result in 2 days, 1 day,
mm,
3 hours, rather than 12 weeks, you know? And so
mm.
you're right in a sense of,
Sorry, you back on mute, I think.
am I? Oh, hold
Oh,
on.
you're back. Sorry.
Back.
So maybe it's maybe it might be my audio. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Uh, oh no, it's because hold on. It's saying my internet is unstable for some reason. I don't know why, 'cause I thought I had a good internet, unless the kids are hammering Netflix or whatever.
They're streaming something.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're back now. Are we back? Yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right, cool. So yeah, so like your likes of Accenture and Deloitte and all that kind of stuff, that's essentially how they make or made a load of money, which was that they went into, redesign a website or replatform your contact center, and all of a sudden you've got a $3 million AWS cloud bill license because your whole infrastructure has to move to the cloud.
Mm,
And so it was kind of like the entry points into much bigger, much meatier kind of initiatives. Um, the question I think is that, like, although that's the case, is it kind of one, it's a massive task because
mm,
you look at a massive bank, so much history, so much legacy, so many processes, so many policies that it's going to be very challenging for a newcomer and a new entrant to just
mm,
walk into, Bank of America and start worming its way through Bank of America, transforming all of its stuff. Because Bank of America would only actually trust somebody like an Accenture or a Deloitte or someone like that to do that big
mm,
kind of piece of work. Maybe Elon Musk's obviously far different because he's got he's one of the most kind of famous, most wealthy kind of people in the world, and his reputation alone will probably get him into most opportunities, as Sierra Brett from Sierra is kind of proving. Um, but I think it's a much bigger task than is probably
yeah.
appreciated. CX, yes, it might lead to the back end, and that's where the actual issues are, but it's a massive, massive task.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, Kane. A few things came to mind. The one thing is, a few years back, I read the autobiography of Lou Gerstner. He was the CEO of IBM, and he took over as CEO of IBM when they were at the verge of stop existing, right? So they were bankrupt. The brand would have disappeared. And then he had to aggressively re-engineer IBM, and like their processes and in policies and procedures. And then he said, like re-engineering an organization, he said it's like setting your hair on fire and putting it out with a hammer. You don't know what's worse. So I think that, and he had to do it to save the companies. I think that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Um, but to that also, I mean, I recently, actually a while back, I read this study where it was a study from OpenAI. So they took the training material, product material, like just information they could find within an organization, and they look at the intent, what needed to be achieved, and they created workflows and procedures. That's the most optimal. And then they took that and laid it over the current way of working within that organization, and the procedures and the workflows and things. And then they identified places to optimize and improve productivity and all the rest of it. So I mean, I like that approach, in terms of taking the current documentation and training materials that's available, but I also like the offline audit kind of approach, consultancy approach that they use for AI, because I'm so used to real time custom experience things. It was a nice way to use it offline, create those graphs, those journeys, and compare it what's happening in the organization and try and optimize from that. But I agree with you. That's all that to say is that that a customer experience layer that sits on top, it can only do so much. And if the company has got bigger problems, then that it's hard to solve that.
Yeah. It's interesting because, do you remember when Satya Nadella was on? I can't remember what podcast he was on, but it was a year ago or 2 years ago or so. And he was saying basically that, if you think about Microsoft, Excel or Word or all these platforms, they're just kind of like databases with a GUI on top. And ultimately, AI is going to handle the business logic. So therefore, the GUI or the platform layer is consumed by AI. So you don't need the GUI or the logic layer because the logic layer is AI. And a database is trivial because it's like compute, or it's like
Mm,
hosting, or it's like whatever. It's a commodity type of service. And so the value is not in the database and the GUI. The value is in essentially the business logic layer. And he was saying that
uh,
the business logic layer is going to move to AI. And therefore, essentially, organizations can transform themselves by having a sensible and, I suppose, transformative way of thinking about data and where data is stored and how it's housed and how it's used,
mm,
with AI kind of layers on top of it that
mm,
essentially handle the business logic. And I kind of was thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, that makes perfect sense because you think about any business that has, a CRM. That's basically all a CRM is. It's just data,
mm,
different fields and a GUI on top of it. And if you think about even down to like booking systems or payment systems or case management
mm,
systems, they're all kind of fairly similar type of stuff. And if you break them down, you were talking about Jensen Huang talking about breaking jobs down into tasks. If you have the same approach to systems and you break a payment
mm,
system down into capabilities, what does it do? or it keeps credit card information. It uses this API to call, I don't know, WorldPay or whatever to take a payment. And then it stores the receipt here and it sends an email to that person there. Break all of that down into its isolated capability, and everything's actually fairly trivial. I was
mm,
government earlier on, like there's just systems, providers of government systems that are legacy providers that sit there, and the system basically does like one thing that's like super risky to try and recreate, which is like tax calculations or whatever it might be. But the reality is that someone's built that system and it performs in a deterministic way, therefore it can be reproduced. If
mm,
it's just doing calculations and it's a database, then it's just a calculator in a database. That's not that difficult. But
mm,
the challenge is, I think, in getting a business like Bank of America or Lloyd's Bank or any big
mm,
telco, Vodafone, getting those businesses to move from tried and trusted providers that they spend a lot of money on to outsource that risk of getting the payment details wrong, and having them move more towards what I would consider like an extremely light, kind of like horizontal
mm,
approach to their business. It's hard. You were saying like transforming a business is like setting your hair on fire, and that's why, because someone gets paid
mm,
a lot of money to keep that system where it is. You know what I mean? And the person who manages them they're the ones who are going to bear the risk of getting it wrong. And if they do get it wrong, it's not
mm,
is it a job costing type of situation. But if your payment system goes down or your customer database is corrupted or whatever it might be, because businesses rely so much on technology, some of those mistakes could be business threatening as well.
mm,
So I think there is quite a lot of risk involved in doing it, even though theoretically or even practically it is entirely perfectly doable.
mm. Yeah, I love what you're saying because recently I've been binging on Sarah Go's content, from Conviction. And she had an interview with Satya Nadella, and maybe that's the one you saw, but maybe just two things on what you said. Like, the one thing I found interesting was that exactly to what you said. He spoke about the current business applications that's got the data sits at the bottom. Then you've got like a layer of business logic and a bit of config, and then you've got the different user interfaces.
Mm.
And now in a agentic era, you can have data, the agency or agentic level with a bit of configuration. And to your point, like it's just the data sits somewhere and it needs to be accessed. I want to link that to Sarah Go recently wrote a blog called The Untrainables, and basically what she intended to say in that blog is that there is all of this information exactly what you're saying. All this information sitting in organizations, which is like hard to reach. It's hard to train on that. And she spoke about how we're going to get to a stage where we're going to move past this user experience, user interface layer where we're currently, and we need to get down to that data layer where it's messy, it's fragmented, it needs the hard work, it needs human intervention to pull it all together, to get to that different pockets of information which people retrieve and and combine and take actions on. So I think the data component. I mean, I think if you ask me what's the future, I mean, there's a whole host of companies popping up now that's which is interesting, that mostly Israeli companies that's focusing on AI security
Mm.
and data security that's AI driven. So I think data security and AI security, that's going to be a big focus. But then, especially after this whole Hugging Face open AI fiasco. But then secondly, I think the data plane or the data component is going to become hugely important. And I spoke to an exec a while back at a conference, and I said to him, like, why aren't more companies getting involved in data? Exactly what you were saying now, Kane, because that's where it sits. Like, that's a system of record. And this guy said to me, because it's too messy and it's too hard.
Mm.
And I think that's the right answer. It is difficult, but I think that's where, and to this essay I read of Sarah Go, I think that's where a lot of value currently sits. I don't like the term unlock value. Everyone's using it. But there's a lot of value to be unlocked when it comes to data.
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing that kind of digital transformation was supposed to solve, wasn't it? You know, big term, that big term from like 2010 or whatever it was, and everyone kind of went and moved everything to the cloud. And some did, some didn't. Some have still got their own homegrown stuff. Some have kind of got like, off the shelf SaaS stuff or whatever. And it's kind of like that initial wave of digital transformation was supposed to solve that. And off the back of that, or as part of that, you had like big data and data lakes and data warehouses and all these fancy terms, which were supposed to be basically exactly what we're describing, organizing your data in such a way that your business can actually use it properly. Yet we're
Mm,
still in a situation where, and this is just how businesses work, isn't it? Is that the person who's responsible for this bit does that bit as best as they can at the time. But that bit is not in sync with this bit because that's someone else's responsibility. And so they do something
mm,
different, store some data in a different place, bring in a different provider that does something differently. And all of a sudden, times that across a business of, 50,000 people, and you've got carnage, which is why it's so messy because everything's built with stick and plasters and everything's kind of patched and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it is big and it is messy.
mm.
So I suppose that the question I think would be interesting to get your thoughts on is where do you see things realistically heading? Do you think that businesses will do take that hard road and go through the pain and suffering of really kind of like getting underneath the fundamentals and foundations of their business, sorting their data out so then they can build AI services on top of it that are, I suppose, fit for the
Mm,
AI generation? Or will things like computer use and, all of those type of things actually be used instead to save them doing that work and keep everything that they've already got, but use AI to try and, I suppose, speed some stuff up or remove some human effort from the process or whatever.
Yeah, while you were speaking, Kane, so many things came to mind, but maybe just to mention three things. Well, I used to work for the public service many years back in South Africa, which was quite interesting. And I remember there was a process, so we worked with maps, and it was a process of digitally capturing maps, right? So we were scanning maps and tracing them on these big, tables. And then it was said like eventually the digital capturing of maps will end because land surveyors will submit those maps digitally from their side. So it'll be digital end to end. And then they also said all data will be geographically underpinned. So every picture, everything will, all digital data will have a geographic location pin attached to it. And okay, and I was like, wow, like how is this going to happen? Right? How's the whole world's going to digitize for us to, and eventually it happened, right? Like if you think about, um, all data it currently is digitally underpinned because of phones and so that whole shift happened. So I think that the bigger part is like there's a wider shift needs to take place. A wider transformation needs to be take place. Like the whole ecosystem needs to change. But second to that, I I think what's really hard when you spoke about data, Kane, is um like I see data as like this pyramid. Context is a pyramid. And so recently, a while back, Sam Altman said that context is intelligence. So you can't have a conversation without context. And normally context comes from memory. Like I see you, I meet you on the street and my memory comes back and there's context to our conversation. And context is stored as data somewhere in a database. And I see context as this pyramid, like the bottom is like the internet, like publicly available information. That's the widest context. And then you've got organizational context, data that's pertaining to an organization. And then there's my personal information in that company, another layer of context. And then the highest level of context is my current conversation. And something I realized that's immensely hard, and even that came to mind now when you spoke about data, is that to deliver the right chunk, the right reference information for every dialogue turn, I mean, I think that's why conversations break down, and I think that's the hard part where, as you have a conversation and there are numerous dialogue turns, for each of those turns in that conversation, the agent or whatever the AI agent must retrieve data from the organization to serve as context. And I've just realized, like, retrieving the right chunk of information as context for each dialogue turn, the most relevant, most accurate. I think that's the challenge, like retrieving it on the fly. And maybe thirdly, and lastly, I was wondering, like, to what I said previously, like this whole forward deployed engineers. I was recently looking at a job description of a forward deployed engineer. This guy had to be like, it's one of the big AI native custom experience companies, but that FDE must be a business analyst, a developer, a salesman, sales engineer, the whole works. But again, I was wondering, like, if these FDEs aren't seen as the change agents within organizations to, obviously it's a good business case and it creates stickiness for AI companies, but to kind of like push that frontier further into the organization step by step. So again, like the customer experience being the beachhead, and then from there, like just this war of attrition, just
Yeah.
transforming the organization bit by bit,
Yeah.
um, without too much disruption. Sorry, that
Yeah.
was a whole.
I don't know if you can avoid the too much disruption bit. I think you're right in a sense of if you can find that person or these people, and you're right that these people need to be like Swiss Army knives, but only Swiss Army knives that are absolute specialists in every single area
Mm,
rather than generalists. Otherwise, you need a team of people full of specialisms. Um, but you're right that I think it's a good way of being able to get into a relationship with a company that's not one of saying, automate me these calls, which is a lot
mm,
more of the kind of like the RAG stuff, the routing type of stuff. But instead, it's around if a business has an objective like, I need to save X amount of money next year, or I need to reduce our handle time by Y, or I need to do something very specific like that. That's a
mm,
far better conversation because then you can get into the
yes.
conversation about, oh, here's the best way to do it then, rather than I think the
Uh,
conversations that are very challenging is we need to automate 30% of phone calls because you're
yeah.
starting with the wrong problem. If you know, you're starting with the solution of the automation of the phone call rather than the bigger objective of saving money or, being more efficient or whatever it might be. Because if you start from the higher problem, you can then explore the best way of doing that
Mm,
rather than the knee-jerk reaction being chatbot on the website, automate that. Does that make sense?
uh, Kane, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. I mean, like I was, um, I mean, to cut costs, to increase revenue. I think more and more organizations are thinking about things like that, where it's, what can they measure, where can they save, where can they create revenue, and exactly to what you're saying. I mean, that was actually music to my ears because technology is not the answer, to every question,
Mm,
or the latest technology. It's really what benefits the organization. Um, I think that's the key thing. I mean, like, I'll give you a simple example. I was in a meeting, and I think there was a chief technology officer, and someone spoke about AI agents and ultimate autonomy, full autonomy, fully autonomous. And then the CTO said, "Hang on, like in my organization, there is no full autonomy." He said the CEO or the chairman of the board doesn't have full autonomy. There are checks and balances and agreements and all the rest of it. So then he said, like, stop talking about full autonomy. And I guess like the reality is whatever serves the customer or the organization best is best.
yeah.
Often it's painful. It's like, bad medicine. But I agree with you that that's a reality. I guess if more tech companies land that reality, they'll do better.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, we're coming. I know we're about on time. I've got a quick fire round of buzzword
Okay.
bingo, if you're up for it, right?
Let's do
Because,
it.
because you're the guy who is across all of this stuff better than anyone else I know, I've gone through some of your recent publications and called out a few terms that I don't think everyone will necessarily know. I think that there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the open source world that doesn't make it to the enterprise until it's been kind of either productized or whatever,
Mm.
which takes a little while. And so you're really abreast of the things as they happen, as well as when they make it to enterprise. So be interesting to get your thoughts on some of this stuff. So I'm just going to call a name, quick fire. I'll call a name, and you just give us a one sentence definition.
Right.
Sound good?
Let's try. I'll try and make it.
Try, try and see if you can remember all the AI generated content. I'm joking. So here we go. We've got an interesting one. Fleet engineering.
Fleet engineering, I would say, is getting multiple agents to work together. So this whole idea of you've got sub agents, task is divided among sub agents, and those different sub agents orchestrate and work together to accomplish the task. So that's the whole idea behind fleet engineering.
All right, fleet engineering. What about, so what's the difference between fleet engineering and an agent swarm?
Sure. Good question. I think in many respects they're the same. But in my mind, I would say agent swarm. I use Grok CLI on my machine. I used to use Claude CLI. I just see how they just dispatch agents, run process parallel, and then dispose those agents of those agents again. So it's like they spun up and deprecated. So I would say that's an agent swarm. When it comes to agent fleet, I would say like the approach we follow at organizations, more defined agents, some deterministic, some non-deterministic. They've got different relationships between them, escalation, sub-dialogue. So it's a more of a defined approach, and tasks are defined to agents, and there's like a longevity to the agents, if I can
Right.
put it like that. I would say that's fleet engineering in my mind.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So what's the difference between fleet engineering, agent swarms, and orchestration? Agent orchestration.
Um, it's getting harder. Okay, so I'll still stick to my agent swarm definition and my into my fleet engineering. Orchestration could be different tasks and not necessarily just agents. Because if I look at in graphs or building flows, or as some people call it RPA 2.0, robotic process automation, you can orchestrate different agents, but also different tasks, or use tools or integrations that's a subset of those agents. So I would think of orchestration widely as not just agents, but different tools or even just like a sequence of events you've put into one node.
Yeah,
You orchestrate. Often there's human involvement as well, where you give it to a human and then they respond or they give feedback and it goes back into the process.
brilliant. All right. What about context engineering?
Well, I would say, I would say context engineering is just a fancy word for RAG. you know, so it's like just like I think in the old days someone would say, I'm just building a call flow. Now you're doing graph engineering. So I would say context engineering is basically building the context for a conversation or the contextual reference for the conversation. And as I said, like I always think of context as this triangle and different layers that fill up the context. And I mean, the typical thing is if you can't find an answer in your personal information, I go to the enterprise information. If it's not there, I go to the web, but I give a general answer I just found from the web or wherever. So I would say context engineering is just this way of engineering the best contextual reference for the conversation at any particular point in the dialogue.
Nice. I've actually seen quite a few different job titles with context engineering recently. So that one's catching on. What about no, I've read that one. Harness engineering. How about that one?
Um, yeah, I mean, like, so something that I think the easiest reference for harness engineering, where it really opened up to me was when I started using Claude CLI, right? So where it's this framework that runs on my machine, and a lot of the logic and the working sits in this framework, and it's got a memory file and my preferences, and so the whole idea is to decouple from the model. Currently, so I've moved from Claude Code CLI to Grok CLI, especially when they bought over Cursor and they use the Cursor model. And so I think harness engineering is just becoming model independent. So the model can be swapped out, but your memory, your preferences, your way of work, it all stays within this harness.
Nice. All right. And what about loop engineering?
Well, so I'm kind of onto loop engineering now, Kane. Like I really use it. So I didn't want to run um, Hermes or OpenClaw or any of these claws, these AI agents on my machine. It just felt too complex. I was wondering, like, I mean, what will it actually do, and all the rest of it. And then I just started creating loops. So, like a loop for me is just like this glorified cron job. So I've got a whole lot of repositories, on GitHub, and I've got loops that runs that say, look at the submissions from contributors. Can it be merged? If it can't be merged, respond to them. So I like to call loop engineering agent light, where it's just like a scaled down little process with some intelligence and agency you want to run, and you want to run it once daily or once weekly to go and do something and come back. Um, so that's my definition of loop engineering.
So would that be for a more of a repeatable task?
I would say it will be for a repeatable task. Um, yeah, a repeatable task you want to run, and more like with more supervision as well, but something you want to run repeatably, and obviously leverage a large language model to have some level of autonomy or agency built into it.
Hmm. Cool. All right. Have we got any more? Hill climbing.
I love hill climbing. So here's my explanation of hill climbing. So recently I listened to Jensen Hang. He said something that I found interesting. He said that all software, current software as we know it, Excel, PowerPoint, it's pre-recorded, right? So all software is, even though if it sits on that data layer you spoke about, but the application logic and the UI, it's pre-recorded. It's developed, it's published. Sometimes versions come out. What do you do if you report a bug in traditional pre-recorded software? Well, if I click here and I click there, then this doesn't happen. And then a software support guy gets your ticket, he clicks, oh, I've replicated this problem, and then he fixes it. Now you've got a agentic application. It's non-deterministic. It's different. The answer is correct, but it's different all the time, right? So you can't follow the traditional way of replicating that error. And so that's why the whole idea of hill climbing comes in, where you run agent evals and you test your application on 3 points. So the one is the large language model performance. The second is the user experience, which you can get from CSAT and NPS and those things. And the third thing is the application performance. And then you've got to use AI evals to continuously improve this application. And that's where the whole idea of hill climbing comes in. And it's the concept of hill climbing exists due to the fact that you can't like replicate errors. You've got to have this continuous process of improving your application.
Right. So it is the would it be fair to say that it is essentially the discovery and rectification that persists in order for the hill, the software, so to speak, to get better, and the agent is climbing the hill as it's discovering issues and fixing them, getting to the top.
Yes, exactly that. And I think that's why the harness engineering becomes important, because those improvements you want to like incorporate or save somewhere, and that you do within the harness. So I always say the harness is owned, but the model is rented, because like and dozens of models gets deprecated every year and
Mm.
discontinued. So the hill climbing can help you then to also measure what will be the impact if you swap out models, and and if you can then save those improvements within the harness, then you're not at the behest of the model provider.
Interesting, interesting. Um, what are the kind of like recent developments within AI that you think will have the biggest impact in the enterprise in the next 12 months?
So I think um, so I think like maybe I mean like I think where the opportunities lie is definitely the data portion. I don't know how exactly how that will look, but I think, to if someone makes inroads into the data portion, as we spoke earlier, there's a big opportunity. Secondly, I think security, AI-driven data security, but also security around AI agents will become more important. I mean, the attack surface, if you think that attack surface, like with email or whatever, kind of static, but the attack surface with AI agents is dynamic. So I think that whole industry will really boom and become really relevant. But the second thing is, I think kind of like I think as we're kind of like building this thing in flight. So I think as AI is being used, new things will emerge. Like when we had prompt engineering, then we had RAG, then context engineering, then loop engineering and harness engineering and hill climbing. So I think um, as things unfold, as companies want to implement software, they need to invent these intermediate steps, and that's the hard part to predict. So I think three things: data, security, and then thirdly, being close to the customer, seeing what's the need, and then inventing or building those sub steps to get there. And I think that's why we continuously have these new terms that's unfolding.
Interesting. Final question, what are some of the either the terms or the kind of like, I don't know, the news or the hype or the developments or the things that are going on that you think are red herrings, load of rubbish?
Well, the biggest red herring we had recently was open claw,
Yeah.
and Maltbook, the social media thing. I mean, like Peter Steinberger, the founder and the father of OpenClaw, he said many of those rogue bots were engineered, right? So people like prompted the bot or led it to be rogue to create something newsworthy.
Mm.
Um, so I think this whole thing about Maltbook, and I mean, it was actually so thin. um, it was actually found that the open claws are actually very dormant. It's not this active thing that's. So I think the whole hype around the personal agents, open claw bots. I think that was Maltbook agents collaborating, working together. Uh, I mean, I'm very suspicious of these videos saying they invented their own language, and um, you know, I think agents are still very much instruction driven. So I think that whole idea around that was completely overhyped and completely out of context.
Mm.
And if you listen to Peter Steinberger, he says so himself. It was just people creating hype.
And
Um,
you don't hear about it at all now, do you? I haven't heard
yeah,
about it for absolutely ages. I haven't heard anything about it. I haven't seen it anywhere. It seems to have disappeared.
yeah, it's kind of like. I think it did establish the whole idea of a claw. So currently there's this whole idea of there's an agent and a claw, where agent is something that acts on your behalf with your credentials and your logins, and a claw has got its own personality, own identity rather, its own logins. So it did establish this idea between a claw and an agent, where the one is kind of like more autonomous with its own security identity within an organization, and an agent acts on your behalf, most probably through a conversational interface. So it did establish this new concept of what a claw is in an agent. But for the rest, I think the Maltbook idea and the whole agent idea, that's being like nefarious and like, self-propelled, I think that completely died down.
Hmm.
Um,
What are your thoughts on like computer use? Because the experiments that have been done on it in the last kind of 12 months or so is that task success rate is relatively low, so to speak. But obviously that's the first version of these type of tools, and presumably it's only going to get better from there. So where do you think that kind of technology will go?
so yeah, there I can really speak on first-hand experience. So I've built a few computer use frameworks on my MacBook. I used OpenAI's framework. I used the virtual machine of Anthropic, and I also used this open source computer use interface. It's clunky, it's slow, it's not very accurate. It takes way too long to click and go through. It feels like that's something of the past. The new idea that's really powerful, I think Anthropic has got this idea of universal agents. So the whole idea of universal agents is that it doesn't have set integration to systems. It develops in Python or whatever the integration it needs on the fly. And so I've been using, so of late, I've been using Claude Code CLI. Now I'm using Grok CLI just in the command line, just typing. Kane, I've been blown away by the deep integration it's got to my machine. The way it can find information, I give it an instruction, it writes the code, convert this PowerPoint to PDF, use this template. I was just amazed in terms of the instructions I could give it and the way it downloads. So I've got it an always approve, right? So it doesn't prompt me. I just give it a task. I've got tasks that literally run for an hour or 2 hours,
Mhm.
where I just give it a set of instructions and it goes off and it does it. So that harness is installed on my machine. And currently I use Grok 4.5, I think, 5.4, I can't remember. But Claude Code CLIs, it's not just for coding, it's just a command line interface. And it's immensely powerful to run tasks and do things on your machine. Um, so um, I think that's extremely, and also you can define loops within that. And you can say, well, do this task for me every day. This task I just did, do this every day for the next 7 days, 7 o'clock in the morning. And it just runs it and he does it. So that for me is a very powerful, like really a powerful approach, this whole thing of universal agents. And it's more code based. I think this whole idea of an agent navigating the GUI, it's just too clunky. The GUI was made for humans. I think, for an agent to develop code and to do something and then just deprecate it again, it's much more efficient and faster.
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Cobus, this has been absolutely fantastic, as it always is. Always enjoy a discussion with you, my friend. What should we do? Should we put some links? Obviously, you've got a lot of stuff that you write, Substack, Medium, all that kind of stuff. We'll put those links in there. Your LinkedIn,
Right.
Kore.ai website. Anything else we've missed?
No, I think that's about it. I think worst case, if you can't go anywhere, just go to cobusgreyling.com and you'll find all my links are there.
Right,
Cobus with a C.
perfect, perfect. Nice one.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cobus. Always a pleasure, my
Thanks,
friend.
Ken.
Cheers.
Thanks. Chat
Anna.
soon. Bye.